And we are now welcoming you to a conversation, a WTTW community conversation about the Black church. This is our story. This is our song. And we're delighted that you're here to participate. And I have one of the most august panels I've had the pleasure of moderating in some time, including some folks who were in the documentary. Please join me in welcoming Reverend Waltrina Middleton, the Executive Director of the Community Renewal Society. Thank you, Reverend Middleton. Also, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, the Senior Pastor at Trinity United Church of Christ. Thank you. Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray Jr., President of the Chicago Theological Seminary, and Reverend Taurean Webb, Director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience at Garrett Theological Seminary. Thank you all so much for being here. Dr. Henry Louis Gates has done it again with another series that gets into our lives in a way that we long for, to be seen and to have our story told. And in this particular Intimate 4-Hour series, we are tracing how the 400-year-old story of the Black church in America has evolved. And I'd like to just start with the story of our worship in the early history of Africans in America and speak to the role of church and what the documentary calls freedom faith. We went from slave owners or owners of enslaved people using God to hold people back into people understanding that there is a liberating God that they can lean on. But Pastor Moss, let me come to you first. What can you say about that early history, the first history of the Black church in America?
Well, first, I want to say thank you for gathering us for this conversation on the Black church and this outstanding documentary that has been created in conjunction with Dr. Henry Louis Gates and a powerful sister, I might add, from Cleveland, Ohio, by the name of Stacy Holman, who is the producer of the film. So they're a dynamic duo together, the work that they have been doing. The church, or I like to say kind of Black religiosity in America and its early formation, formed on one level a protective garment, a freedom and liberation narrative, and also in many ways a secret society that creating a double entendre, a second language, that white people were not clear about what we were saying. And we did not meet in formal spaces, but were deeply connected to nature and creation. And there is now evidence, clear evidence, of the ecumenical nature of the early formation. The first African Baptist church in Savannah, Georgia, the oldest independent church in America, African-American church. Had an opportunity to have a tour there. It's also part of the Underground Railroad. Members of that church, when America said, "Will you fight for us?" In reference to the revolution, they said, "We'll fight for the British because they said we can be free." Number one. Number two, in the church, in the architecture of the church, spaces where Black people could hide so that they could make their way north. In the architecture, and all throughout the church, you have African language and symbols, and the benches are still in the balcony, made by those Africans. Their names etched in the bench, but it's in Arabic. So you had a church where people were saying Allah and Jesus at the same time. Because of Black religiosity and the beautiful tapestry of our spirituality.
Well, that's education right out the gate. Thank you so much. Taurean Webb, what would you add to that history?
So let me also say thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be here with persons whom I greatly respect. One thing that I've really come to appreciate about the institution, right? You know, that is this cultural institution that is the Black church, is that insofar as it has such a in some ways a complicated history, right? A vexed history, one that has oftentimes been unkind to folks and caused harm to folks, a lot of folks, a lot of the time. Insofar as that is the case, it's also the case that there are great parts of the tradition worth preserving. Our work then, and Dr. Stephen Ray has reminded so many of us, has reminded me of this, in fact, several times. Our work, as best we can, is to preserve the parts of the tradition worth preserving and leave behind the rest. When I think about the role that Black worship has played in freedom making, right? In the carving of Black freedom dreams. One thing I have great appreciation for were the ways in which particularly Black music and dance has allowed our folks to both imagine and bring the not yet into the right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
One day I was walking along, Jesus, come bless my soul, right? I heard a voice, but couldn't see none. Jesus done bless my soul. He done been here, come and gone away. It's a classic spiritual cone talks about this, that both serves to affirm the fundamental humanity of a people, right? In a moment when white folks oftentimes didn't even believe the Black folks had souls in the first place. Both affirm the souls of the people, as well as kind of projecting forward this sense of bringing the future into the right now.
Thank you. And let's come to Reverend Stephen Ray. How would you answer that question about the early days of the church in America?
I think certainly let me also say what an honor it is to be a part of this conversation and commenting on a wonderful production by Dr. Gates and his associates. I think the only thing that I would add to this conversation is that one of the things that we don't often claim robustly enough is that by 1790, most of the Africans who would come to the United States were already here.
Mm.
So what that meant was that the church that is born, the AME church in particular, but the Baptist churches as well, which were born in the latter part of the 18th century and in the early 19th century, that's the 1800s, were squarely Americans. Right, they clearly had a sense of what their African heritage was, and they carried that forth in terms of the ways in which they did worship. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons why if you turn off the music and you watch sort of the march of Black ushers in their white dresses and Black suits, and you pair that with the march of some African ceremonial dancers, it looks amazingly alike. They carried that with them. But it's, you know, we want to remember that the only place that many of them knew was here in the United States, because by the time you get particularly to 1820, 1830, maybe about 30, 40 years from that time, most of the Black people in America had no memory of who their ancestor was who came here, because we came from so many different spaces. Now, I only lift that for one point, to say that that should lead us to celebrate the creativity of these people, to be able to mesh and construct an entirely new identity, and do so by synthesizing both the traditions that were remembered and performed. Because the thing about Black religion is that Black religion remembers by its performance. It doesn't remember by doctrine. It remembers by its performance of the faith. And so by performing the faith, they remember their Africanicity, but at the same time, they took that and they built something entirely and utterly new. And so, I want to make sure we hold on to that piece of creativity of constructing this new thing.
That is very beautiful. And Dr. Waltrina Middleton, your response to that as well. I got some goosebumps thinking about my mother was a deaconess in the same church for 72 years, recently made her transition. And all of those rituals, had a lineage that Dr. Ray so eloquently referred to. I'd love you to talk a little bit about the first church and then segue into later years after the Civil War, or even during the Civil War, if you may.
Thank you. My condolences in the loss or transitioning of your mother as an ancestor, and also celebrating and giving thanks to all that made this documentary possible. I would say, just as kind of echoing what Dr. Ray has shared, just as the Black experience have protracted trauma, where there is an enduring sense of trauma from our being uprooted from our native land, there is also protracted memory. And so the cultural memory is something that I look at as an invaluable component of the origins of the Black church. And what comes to mind is Sojourner Truth, who as a young child was enslaved on a Dutch plantation, was separated from her family. And the plantation where she was sent to, she built an altar without any understanding of like what's the symbolism of this altar. And the recollection is it came from teachings of her mother, but also traditions that were passed down from her African ancestry. And so for the capacity for this young child to build an altar, and even to have the notion to build an altar, is quite phenomenal and speaks to that prophetic imagination that Dr. Ray referenced. And of course, when we think of the creative ways that we created safe space to retain that religiosity that we've also mentioned, we think of the brush arbors. Toni Morrison poetically described the clearing in her novel, Beloved. And so the rituals, the practices of the ring shout, the calling of the elders, all of those rituals are connected to our African identity that help to shape Black church practices while confined under enslavement. And so I think it's really critical to understand that Black church tradition is intersectional in many ways, in the spirit of Ubuntu. I am because we are. A lot of times we'll say I am because we are, but we don't go the step further and say we are because God is. And what Ubuntu also teaches us is our connection with the environment, as well as our connection with people. And so the origins of the Black church is tangible in the sense that it's the environment, it's the spirit, it's the things we can touch and the things we cannot see or touch. And so the fact that Black communities had the audacity to create space where they could creatively still gather and speak in native tongue and practice indigenous religions all help to create the boldness of the Black church. And coming from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, where that church was birthed out of resistance, the boldness that we see there was inspired, I believe, from the courageous tenacity of our ancestors who worshiped in the brush arbors.
Well, and that moves us along in history quite beautifully from the era where you might have someone saying, yes, sir, at the front door, and then helping people to escape to freedom in the back door, and continuing legacies and rituals from our ancient ancestors. But then what about the church's role up into the Civil War? emancipation, the Jim Crow period. There's so much both pain there and a growth of excellence and joy. And Pastor Moss, I'm going to come to you for that historic perspective as well.
Well, thank you. Excuse me. One of the interesting things about Black religiosity, the Black church, this community that has been created, is in reference to resistance and all of the different forms of resistance. As I mentioned before, First African was a form of resistance in how the church was built. Every brick was liberated from somebody else's plantation. So it's a reparation building, literally. It is literally a reparation building. But when we take a look at South Carolina, which is, especially Charleston, is a resistant space for Black churches. I mean, revolt after revolt after revolt. I mean, we always remember the big three is the ones that are lifted up. Gabriel, Denmark, and Nat. But, the research that's being done now, about 126 revolts, 121 of them happened when people gathered in what we call the church. So when Black people got together in free Black space without the ear hustling of white people, then all of a sudden we planned because it was our space. So when you move into the Civil War, you already have resistance that's happening. There's now research that's being done in reference to Black women and cooking, and come to find out that many fires that happened in Southern spaces were done when certain women decided that we're going to burn this place down. And that there is research to say that that is one of the reasons why they kept baking the kitchen at a greater distance from the bigger house. Because that was a form, again, of resistance, of people making the claim, the fire next time, literally, we're going to do it right now. So you have these spaces, free Black spaces, that allow for Black people to have imaginative, prophetic imagination, free agency, and to envision a world that is not yet. And as they come through the Civil War period, we then have out of the church, you then have the historical Black college movement. That in these spaces that were ours, we then use these spaces to educate. Just one little thing, and I'll be quiet. But Robert Smalls from South Carolina, who essentially is the person who starts our public school system, when he sets up schools for emancipated Black children, is also a part of a movement that then begins that these spaces that we have can also be independent colleges, which were then connected to denominations, and there's a whole history in and around that. But we need to really understand how intertwined the Black church is with the birth of other Black institutions and collective Black freedom. We just have to have that conversation. It can't be a black or white conversation. The church is this, the church is not that. That literally it's like a human being. It has incredible beauty, brokenness, blessedness, all of that mixed together. And we have to hold it in our arms and recognize the beauty even in the cracks of it. Because as one writer says, the cracks is how God lets the light in.
Well, there's so much there. This is the part of the documentary that's really about a nation within a nation, and all of the institutions that were starting to emerge at that time. Just one more bit of feedback on that question. Reverend Ray, what would you add to that historic period, and maybe bringing us even a little more into the 20th century?
Well, I think the piece that I would add to that is to recall, and this is one of the things we have to remember, is that the Black church existed in slavery, but it existed in freedom as well. So what, you know, the part of the Black church of which I'm a part, the Black Congregationalist, we date our history all the way back to 1819. So I was the assistant pastor at a church that was founded in 1819 as the African Meeting House. Now, I bring that up because we've all heard about the story of the Amistad captives and how they came to Connecticut, and there was an abolitionist movement that grew up around them. Well, the very first meeting of those abolitionists was held at the Talcott Street Congregational Church, which was a Black congregational church. And so a significant piece of the history of the abolitionist movement was the history of Black abolitionists. And they were almost to a person, Black people who were parts of these traditions that were the free Black church. Many of them had been free for a very long time. So I only lift that up to say that we have this complexity. And when we look at least in the beginning, the significant numbers of people who were being recruited to the Black units within the Union Army were being recruited through many of these churches and many of these people who were agents. So, when we lifted up the abolitionist movement, we often think about Frederick Douglass and a few other people, but there was a huge fingerprint of Black people there. And those very same people were major instruments in recruiting people to fight in the Civil War. Now, why that becomes important is that it was the Black participation in the Civil War that was the primary argument for full Black citizenship and for Black people gaining, at that time it was Black men, because Black women, along with other women, were prescribed in it. But that was the fundamental argument in the 15th Amendment the 14th Amendment that granted us full citizenship, was that we had fought in the Civil War and fought at a time that our participation was decisive. And all of that began with the Black church. All of that was organized with the Black church. So while the Black church was an institution of freedom in the South, it was also an institution of freedom in the North. And one of the things that happened as Reconstruction was constricting the lives of Black people and the political power of Black people, the Black church gained a significant force as the primary political and economic, as well as educational engine for Black people, because, and this was something that plays itself out powerfully in the Civil Rights Movement as well, it was the only institution that we owned. It was the only institution.
That is a wonderful segue into the engine that made so much change during the Civil Rights movement. But let me just remind folks who might have joined late, this is a WTTW community conversation about the Black church. This is our story. This is our song, executive produced by Henry Louis Gates, and in partnership with the wonderful sister that Dr. Moss mentioned from Cleveland. I know you're originally from Cleveland, getting your home folks in there. And there's always a woman behind any great thing, right? We are speaking with an august panel, Dr. Waltrina Middleton, Executive Director of the Community Renewal Society, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III, Senior Pastor at Trinity, United Church of Christ. We just heard from Reverend Dr. Stephen G. Ray, President of the Chicago Theological Seminary, and Taurean Webb, Reverend as well, and the Director of the Center for the Church and the Black Experience at Garrett Theological Seminary. And I'm going to come to you, Reverend Webb, to bring us to the part of the church that many of us grew up with, a place for comfort, a place to learn to lead, a place that shaped culture and very much shaped the civil rights movement and the movements that we know today. Talk a little bit about that era in the Black church and, if possible, Chicago's role.
Sure. So part of, and I'm gonna jump to this contemporary moment. I want to name just for a moment part of what I'm sitting with, this feeling very embodied for me, right? So I'm deeply resonating with Dr. Ray's point about the Black abolitionists kind of forming just a critical mass of the abolitionist engine. I'm also very deeply resonating with Pastor Moss's previous point. And one thing that I always hold, especially when I reflect on what any of this means for us, for Black folks in this moment at present, all throughout the Americas and in what would become these United States in particular, we see moment after moment for hundreds of years, and Black community after Black community filtering their pursuits for liberation through the language of the sacred and the holy, right? So I'm wondering, what might it mean for us to, especially in the present day moment, understand all of our pursuits for Black freedom and liberation, specifically filtered through the language of the sacred, right? Specifically filtered through the language of kind of us doing the work of kind of getting back to this holy of holies. Part of why I think that matters for this early mid 20th century moment, Pastor Moss kind of gestured towards this as well. And I signaled this a bit earlier. I place great premium on the role of the Black church as a cultural institution. So I'm the product of a historically Black college. My pastor here is our one of my Morehouse brothers. But part of what that's done for me is it has cultivated a sense and a sensibility for really taking seriously the role of our Black institutions in preserving Black life. When I think about Black cultural institutions, I'm certainly thinking about historically Black colleges and universities, thinking about Black Greek letter organizations. To a degree, I'm thinking about Black social clubs. But the Black church, I think in many significant ways was chief among them in terms of being a community center of cultural production where Black leadership was developed, Black thought was cultivated, Black ideas were circulated. And these institutions that really took seriously what it means to cultivate leaders with both head and heart. And when I say Black church in this sense, I'm not necessarily talking in this meta sense, but in a very local and jurisdictional way. The Black church was the Black church, as in that one on the corner, right? Was a cultural pillar for our community sustenance and life. And when, even though today we're in a very different, in some ways very different social and political moment, this is a specific legacy of the Black church. I think it's important to not forget.
Well, and Reverend Middleton, that's part of your work. We'll come more into the contemporary with our very last questions, but what do you think about the role of the church, let's say even in the Great Migration, the migration to Chicago, and your perspective as well on the role of the church in civil rights?
Yes, and I appreciate Pastor Moss giving a shout out to my native South Carolina. I grew up in the Gullah Sea Islands of South Carolina. And when I'm hearing my family here speak, I'm reminded of the importance of land, the importance of some of the basic provisions that people value, like an education, a home, etc. And my great-grandparents acquired land, and they built what they call a classroom, a shotgun house that was called the classroom. And that place served as a place of worship, a place to tutor and educate. It had multi-purposes. It was, and it's still standing on their land today. And I remember just the value system that was instilled in me by going to the classroom. Eventually, the community came together and they went beyond the classroom. They built this beautiful structure, St. Mark AME Church in Ravenel, South Carolina. You know, and there, this was the place where we were tutored so that we could excel as students in school. This was the place where we organized and we talked about elections and helped to equip people to understand who's on the ballot, who do we support, and who identifies with the principles and values of our communities. And so the role of the church was there to recognize that the schools were segregated, but that did not mean that we had to limit the capacity in which our children could learn. So we would educate them. We may not have access, and my grandfather created the church union that basically, I forgot how many churches were a part of it, but when people didn't have food to eat or someone's house burned down, they went and not only did they provide for these families and these community members, but they prayed, they had worship with them. You know, they put hands on them. And so I think that we see all of the evidence of the sit-ins, the resistance to lynching, all of the things that we faced in progressing towards the civil rights movement could be found in the ways that even without a building, we were able to come together and create the concept, the heart of what the church is, which is community, family, all of the things that we hold sacred and dear. And at the heart of that is our humanity. What are the things that speak to our humanity, and how do we protect and nurture that when it's rejected in other parts of our cultural society?
Very beautiful. We've talked about resilience, political engine, cultural memory, so many important things. This is not a monolith though, you know, it's our story, this is our song. We have progressives, we have conservatives. My journalism career makes me think about this. At WBEZ, later in my career, we went to Trinity for the Balm in Gilead and the ministry to people with HIV and AIDS. And, you know, it was a church welcoming of people of varieties of sexualities and sexual preferences. Earlier in my career on WVON, I had people calling up saying, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. But it just speaks to the variety of perspectives and the areas for growth. I'm going to come to you, Pastor Ray, Reverend Ray. Talk about the differences in the church. I believe that you talked about being a part of the Pentecostal movement, but how do people, how can we understand that there is so much variety here and so many different roles to play?
I think, you know, I point to, actually, I'm going to make 3 points very quickly. Number one is that just recognize that Black people are human beings. And so what that means is that we so often want to flatten the way that we talk about Black folk as if we're one thing. But I mean, we represent the spectrum of humanity in terms of belief, in terms of social, cultural predilection. But another point I want to raise is that one of the things, and this is an Africanism that I don't think is paid attention enough. Dr. Moss, you may remember when we were in class in Lamansana, had us read John and Beatty's book, West African Philosophy and Religion. And one of the things that Black people brought along with them that comes from a West African worldview is a simple formula, is that sin kills and sin spreads. And if you're not attentive to sin spreading, then sin will end up killing us all. And I only raise that to say that one of the conservative streams in Black religious tradition is one that is deeply inflected by that idea that if we are not careful, our community can be destroyed. And remember, for most Black people, they have deep memories of their communities being destroyed. One of the things that I noted in an article that I wrote is that my family is not the only family who has a memory of someone being lynched because of a sin, right? My family is not the only family that has a memory of folk having to leave in flight in the middle of the night because of a sin. So whether it's real or imagined, so that becomes an important, so we want to get our religion right. Because if we get our religion wrong, it could mean calamity for us. So, I want to lift that piece up because so often people want to talk about particularly conservative Black religion as if it's small-minded, as if it's not modern, as if it's, isn't up to speed. Well, we have to understand where it comes from. Now, we also have to understand that I think that the majority of the Black church is politically progressive, while at the same time being culturally conservative. But I think that cultural conservatism is something that while we have to work it out in the lives of our church, I'm a member of the United Church of Christ, one of the most progressive denominations on the American landscape. But one thing I do understand and appreciate is where Black conservatism comes from, right? It's not just a bunch of small-minded people. Now, it can make people small-minded, but it's not something that comes from small-minded people. It's something that comes from people who ever lived in a case where they understood their communities were at jeopardy and that their communities were in danger.
That's such important context and very well appreciated. But what about the role of the modern pastor? We touch upon that a bit in the documentary. Reverend Moss, talk about that. What is in your portfolio today that might be different from the first days of the church in America, the Black church in America?
That's a tremendous question in terms of thinking that. I think that the remix of today has different vocabulary, but much of the practices would be similar. There is a brilliant individual that many people may not know, but has had a great influence in terms of Black development, a gentleman by the name of William Holmes Borders. William Holmes Borders was also, he was a preacher, he was a poet, he was an actor, and he was a business developer. He played Jesus in the Atlanta Passion play in 1943. And as a result, they tried to burn down the church. And anyway, it's a fascinating story that Black Jesus gets people upset. But he also was an individual who built housing. And he said he believed in this idea of empowerment. He said, they're not making new land, so we must control the land. And this land was called Auburn Avenue in Atlanta, that we have to control this space. And so you have the Borders homes and the Wheat Street towers and all of this business development that was supported by this individual who was also a poet. A poet who influenced the religious rhetoric of a Chicagoan by the name of Reverend Jesse Jackson. So he wrote a poem, William Holmes Borders. The poem is called I Am Somebody. And this poem goes through the history of Black people from arriving from 1619 into 1940. And it's in the Library of Congress. So you have this Renaissance, Paul Robeson style of preacher, who was just a really unique individual. And today you have people who have remixed on that idea that community development is necessary if you are to pastor. That's what we are doing at Trinity. How do we transform 95th Street, which is also borrowed from the heritage of a William Holmes Borders, who said, we've got to control Auburn Avenue because we can't depend upon these other folks out here. They may want an insurrection. Anyway, I digress. And so we just have to be careful. Also within that is the utilization of the arts. So here's William Holmes Borders. He's playing Jesus. He is showing that a Jesus that is one who looks biblical. About this 6'6" black man, dark-skinned gentleman, he says, with a deep resonant voice. And so now you also have churches that are incorporating the arts and are becoming spaces and springboards for people in the arts. And so the modern pastor, the danger, and I would say this, is that, and Professor Ray, who is also president of a seminary and incredibly gifted, and Professor Webb, who is a professor incredibly gifted, is that there are institutions that have recognized our gifting and is trying to give or a doctrine that does not fit the development of our community. And I'll use an example this way. A gentleman was wearing a shirt, I saw a shirt this young man was wearing, it says, "They want our rhythm, but not our blues." So we have white seminary institutions on the conservative side who have done some research and realized the gifts of Black people, but want to shape Black people. They want the rhythm, but don't want us to have to force America to face the blues. So now we have modern pastors who are pastoring, shepherding Black congregations, but they have a white theology that is destructive to the Black soul.
Yes.
Well, yeah, that is bringing us right into the modern moment and giving us a warning about what could be at our door. Thank you so much. And in some ways, I see it in the changing of music, but that's another story, where the music gets changed and softened and toned down. I will just come to you, Reverend Webb. You are the director of the Center for Church and the Black Experience at Garrett. What changes do you see, and particularly around the role of women in the church?
Yeah, so one thing I thinking about kind of where this conversation has led us in terms of recognizing the multi-texturedness, right, and the diversity kind of within this thing that we're calling the Black church. One of the great utilities, I would say, of this present era, and especially I'm thinking, so I'm a millennial, so with my millennial lens, and also kind of having been rather active in a few social movements, whether that's the movement for Black Lives stuff in the U.S. as well as some more global movements. One of the great utilities, I think, of this present moment is that it is forcing all of our institutions, right, all across sector, to confront on some level the ways in which they are implicated. Our institutions are implicated in entire histories of racist, of gendered, of sexualized oppression against people, communities, bodies. And I think that the church, insofar as we can say that there is something that exists called the Black church, I don't think that the Black church is exempt or has been exempt from having to wrestle in a different way with some of those sorts of questions in ways that perhaps it did not have to 50, 20, 15 years ago. For instance, one thing that we see with the rise of several social movements in this country, Black Lives is one of the notable ones, that was specifically understand in its early kind of germination, was specifically understanding itself as different from the social movements of the past century, was one, decentralized leadership, right? But also a decentering of the heteronormative voices. Why is it the case that when we think about the civil rights movement, you know, we have these characters, right? These figures. We think about Malcolm, we think about Martin. To the extent that we think about our Black women, they weirdly in relation to these other kind of Black male figures, right? The present moment is forcing all of our institutions to reckon with that. And one of the ways that I think that gets meted out in church spaces and institutions of higher learning, I would count my seminary, the school at which I teach, among them. These institutional spaces are having to wrestle with, one, the degree to which conversations had not been happening, right, around the role of not only women, but also non-heteronormative identifying folks, but also hold these institutions' feet to the fire in terms of, insofar as we might have had some spaces that said, oh no, yeah, I take that seriously. What the moment has forced us to do is to look at the receipts, right? So I hear you, Church X, saying you take this seriously. Who's on your trustee board? Right? Who is in your pulpit, right? Because we can tell you give yourself away, right? So that's part of what I think we're a number of us are wrestling with in this moment, and I think that we have to wrestle with it and take it seriously, precisely because of, you know, one of these early values that I think we learned from the foremothers and the forefathers of old, right? What does it mean to affirm all of person's humanness, right? In its multiplicities.
Well, there's work to be done. There's beauty, there's history. What will it take to sustain this vital, beautiful, powerful, cultural institution of the Black church?
Mm-hmm.
What will it take for us to order our steps, continue on our many rivers to cross, and all of the other things that we have learned over our time in history? And Reverend Ray, I'll start with you, if you can, in 30 seconds or so. How do we survive and thrive?
Well, the way we survive and thrive is to remember that we exist wholly as God's gift of grace to Black people. And that as long as we recognize, and don't make an idolatry of it, but as long as we recognize that the Black church is God's gift to the world in and through Black people, then we will be able to get the devotion of Black folk that will allow us to continue to remain vital. If we start trying to become something else and start trying to be somebody else's church, then we don't deserve the devotion of Black people. So we shouldn't expect that they will help us to survive. But as long as we recognize that we are God's gift, not only to us, but to the world, then we will have the devotion of Black folk that we need to survive.
Dr. Reverend Waltrina Middleton, what are your thoughts on surviving and thriving?
Thank you. I appreciate. I want to kind of tag on or expand upon the role of women. One of the things that I appreciated was Dr. James Cone when speaking about the Black church and Black liberation. In order for us to eradicate racism, we must also look at the presence of sexism and the culture of patriarchy, and even the perpetuation of white supremacist mentality in the Black church tradition. And so it's not enough to say that, you know, the role of women is shifting, but to really, in a very radical way, disrupt the ways that women are recognized for their contribution, from the missionary, the mother of the church, who give whatever little she can, to those cooking in the kitchen, to those that have a prophetic voice and word, but were denied the right to preach. We're not even allowed to come into the pulpit. So I think that from a womanist perspective, womanism teaches us to look at the full humanity, the wholeness, what makes the community whole. And so we can look to the future by looking at the construct, the models of womanism that teach us that I am because you are, that I cannot be all that God has called me to be unless you are all that you've called you to be. And so we basically have to take seriously the role of women, not only in the church, but the role that women play as leaders in our social and our cultural formation as well, and not only just to teach women, but also to teach those that identify as men the importance of how we embody and celebrate the role of women. And I also think it's really critical that we recognize that moving forward, those things that have been labeled as taboo, like LGBTQ community, that we have to be bold in affirming. Like, it's not enough to say, well, we have this person who directs the choir or who dances in the dance ministry, but we don't want to talk about same gender loving communities in a way that's affirming and welcoming and inclusive. And so how do we go against the grain, challenge stereotypes, and welcome everyone to the table to truly be welcome into the community in the fold of God? And I'll just share one little story. When I was serving on the national setting of the United Church of Christ in Cleveland, we hosted youth at our General Synod. And at the same time, it was Pride Week. And it was also around 2015, Tamir Rice was murdered, Michael Brown was murdered. My own relative was murdered in the basement of the church in Charleston, South Carolina. And we had young Black youth that said we wanted to march in the Pride Parade and we wanted to hold up Black Lives Matter banners. And there were members of the community that said, we'll march in the Pride Parade, but we're not holding up Black Lives Matter banner. And so we posed the question to them, when Black bodies show up to the door of the church, what part of our humanity is welcome to come in? Do we leave our Blackness at the door? Do we leave our queerness at the door? How can we enter into a space where our whole and full humanity is welcome? And we have to do that in a radical and an unapologetic way. And the last thing I'll say is, just as we celebrate the ways that we move forward, we must also look back and be careful not to forget some of the harms that we've suffered in our community. And just as I've mentioned, the suffering of Mother Emanuel and those that were murdered there, that is not something that's new to this 21st century. We understand that the harm, the attack on the Black church, we can look at Trinity, the attack on Reverend Jeremiah Wright, the attack on those girls that were killed in the Birmingham church. All of these things are a part of our history as well. And so we must be very mindful that we do not forget the lament, as well as we look forward to celebrating as we move forward.
Well, thank you. And speaking to the role of women is appropriate. I'm glad that you added your voice to Reverend Webb's perspective. I'm going to come to you, and then Reverend Moss will be the final voice on, briefly, what does it take to sustain and to thrive?
Sure. Well, the one thing that I would lift up here quite simply is I do believe that any of these conversations or kind of energies or movements that will go towards the flourishing and the thriving of the Black church, I think they absolutely have to be multi and intergenerational, because there are things the elders of our community, there are corners the elders can help me see around that I necessarily cannot see around, right? And I think that is absolutely critical, not the least of which, given the fact that we still have folks among us. We still have folks among us who were in the thick of movement building 50, 60 years ago, who and a bit later in the century, lessons learned that can be shared that necessarily we would not have, other than the oral histories or the body memory that's being given, that's being voiced through the oral history. So that's what I would add. I think it's absolutely critical.
Thank you.
And if I can jump in really quickly, I just want to just give a shout out to Dr. Angela Davis, who talked about the importance of, for us to celebrate our liberation, we must recognize the suffering of those in the diaspora. And so we must also understand that it's not, we're talking about this Black church experience here in our locale of the USA, but there are our relatives that were stolen from us, that are dispersed all across the diaspora. So I think it's also forward thinking for us to be interconnected on a global pan-African, if you will, experience as well. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Reverend Moss? You're
I would
on
add
mute.
to the discussion, there are several things. Truth plus humility plus creativity, that we place that on the altar for sustainability. And any truth that we speak, and I borrow from Howard Thurman, that as soon as we speak it, as soon as we think we are speaking a sacred truth, you refine it with a particular language, we are behind it because our vocabulary is inadequate, which means that you must be humble in everything that you speak. But we must demand that we use our creativity to continue to find ways to speak what we can't speak, but still speak nonetheless.
Well, it's been beautiful and humbling for me. If the audience learned a fraction of what I learned, we've gotten some work done here today. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. There is a diaspora, there is a global and an intersectional movement that we all need to be a part of. But part of what brought us here today was that celebration of the Black church. This is our story. This is our song. The full series will air on WTTW, probably starting February 15th and ending the 23rd, depending on what happens. It could start on the 23rd, but you can follow the listings for that. And Pastor Moss, who spoke last, thank you so much, from Trinity United Church. Dr. Waltrina Middleton, who also reminded us of our diaspora and the global aspect of who we are. Thank you so much. Reverend Taurean Webb, maybe our millennial, we like to be intersectional here, but closest, if not that. Thank you for adding your voice. And Dr. Stephen Ray, thank you so much for the perspective and the context you provided. I think unless you're on the cutting room floor, that you and Pastor Moss are also in this beautiful documentary. Thank you for tuning in. This has been another WTTW community conversation. I'm Sylvia Ewing. Please be safe, be well, be kind, and give grace. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Your blessing.
Thank you.
Blessings.